Good morning, and welcome to today's story, a touching, humane, and educational tale.
The girl they stopped listening to. By the time the water started swallowing the festival lights, 17-year-old Mara Collins was already waist-deep in the freezing Marina, pounding on truck windows, dragging children toward higher ground, and shouting directions no one had wanted to hear that morning. The same town that had dismissed her as a stubborn, grieving girl was now following her voice through wind, darkness, and rising tide. In this story, you'll see how grief can sharpen instinct, how quiet people often notice danger first, and how courage is sometimes nothing more than choosing to stand your ground when nobody believes you. On the southern Oregon coast, summer didn't always look soft. Sometimes it looked bright and beautiful from a distance, the kind of beauty tourists loved posting online. Blue water in the bay, seagulls circling over weathered docks, fishing boats rocking lazily in their slips, salt in the air, sunlight spilling across the marina like a promise. But if you grew up there, really grew up there, you learned early that the coast had moods. And Mara Collins had grown up at Collins Point Marina. She knew the sharp smell of diesel on cold mornings. She knew the sound of loose halyards slapping metal masts before a squall rolled in. She knew when the tide was ordinary and when the bay held itself a little too still, like it was breathing in before saying something ugly. At 17, Mara was not the kind of girl people in town described as easy. She was lean, sun-browned, and serious for her age. Her dark hair was usually tied back low, though the wind on the coast never let it stay that way for long. She had her father's steady hands and her mother's watchful eyes. She didn't talk much unless she had something worth saying, and that alone made some adults uncomfortable, especially after her father died. Frank Collins had been the kind of man people respected without saying it often. He ran the marina with a calm, capable rhythm that made hard work look simple. If somebody's engine quit, he helped. If a storm snapped a line, he was already walking the dock before anyone called. He knew the bay the way other men knew city streets. Then one bad afternoon offshore took him away. After that, everything in Mara's life seemed to loosen at once. The marina had already been struggling. Repairs had been delayed for years. Fuel prices kept rising. Tourist traffic was fickle. And when Frank died, the place lost more than an owner. It lost the one person holding all its cracked pieces together. Mara's mother had died years earlier, so there was no soft place left in the house after that. Just her grief, and Calvin Boone. Calvin had married into the family when Mara was still young, and even back then, she had never fully trusted him. He wasn't a monster. Men like Calvin rarely were. He was worse in a quieter way. Practical, impatient, the kind of man who talked about money as if it were the only honest thing in the world. To Calvin, the marina was not memory. It was debt with a view. Over the months after Frank's death, Calvin sold things off one by one. Spare equipment, old crab pots, a backup generator Frank had always meant to fix. He spoke about cutting losses and moving on, as if a whole life could be swept into a ledger and closed out with a pen. Mara watched all of it with a deep, simmering hurt she barely had words for. She still went down to the marina almost every day. She checked ropes, walked the docks, opened old storage rooms just to smell salt, rope, cedar, and oil. It was the only place where her father still felt close. That was what led to the fight. It started in the kitchen just after sunset, with the last orange light fading behind the spruce trees and the sound of a screen door rattling in the wind. Calvin was sitting at the table with a stack of unpaid notices and a legal pad covered in numbers. Mara came in smelling like tidewater and old wood. "You were down there again," he said without looking up. "Still belongs to us." He gave a hard little laugh. "No, it belongs to the bank if I miss one more payment." Mara stood there, arms crossed tight, jaw clenched. Dad would have found a way. The room changed after that. Calvin looked up slowly, and something flinty passed through his face. "Your dad is gone." Mara's throat tightened, but she didn't step back. "That doesn't mean you get to erase him. I'm trying to keep this family afloat." "No," she said, her voice low and shaking now. "You're trying to sell every piece of him until there's nothing left." That did it. Calvin shoved his chair back so hard it scraped across the floorboards. "You want to cling to dead things, Mara? Fine, but you are not dragging me down with you." He pointed toward the door. For a second, she thought he didn't really mean it, that he was angry, cruel maybe, but not serious. Then he said it. "If that marina matters more to you than this house, Then go sleep there. The silence after that was brutal. Mara stared at him, waiting for him to take it back. He didn't. So she picked up her faded backpack, grabbed her father's old work jacket from the hook by the door, and walked out before he could see her cry. The night air hit cold and wet. She made it halfway down the gravel road before the tears finally came, hot and helpless and furious. Not the neat kind people cried in movies. The real kind. The kind that bent your shoulders and made you hate being seen by the dark. By the time she reached Collins Point Marina, the moon was caught behind a sheet of marine cloud, and the docks were silver gray and empty. She used the spare key she still kept hidden under a rusted metal tackle box and stepped into the old office. Dust, salt, paper, silence. It smelled like loss. Mara set her bag down, wrapped herself in her father's jacket, and sat at the old desk where her parents used to work side by side. That was when her hand brushed against a drawer that hadn't opened right in years. She tugged it hard. Inside was a stack of tied notebooks tied together with faded blue string. Her mother's handwriting covered the top one. Mara frowned and pulled it closer. Outside, the wind rose over the bay. Inside, under the weak yellow beam of a desk lamp, a grieving girl opened the first page and found the beginning of something that would change everything. The warning no one wanted. The first thing Mara noticed wasn't the numbers. It was the precision. Her mother's handwriting, neat, deliberate, almost stubbornly consistent, ran across every page like someone who trusted patterns more than people. Dates, tide levels, wind directions, notes in the margins, underlined twice, sometimes 3 times, as if the ocean itself needed to be reminded. Mara leaned closer under the dim, flickering desk lamp. Outside, the wind pressed harder against the marina windows, low and restless. Inside, the world narrowed to paper, ink, and the quiet thrum of something beginning to make sense. She turned a page, then another. At first, it looked like routine observation. Seasonal shifts, normal variations, the kind of data only someone deeply patient would bother to record. But then she saw it, a pattern. Not obvious, not loud. The kind you could miss if you were skimming, or if you didn't want to see it. Every few years, her mother had circled certain dates, marked certain alignments, noted when offshore winds reversed unexpectedly, when the tide rose faster than predicted, when the bay didn't behave the way charts said it should. Mara's brow tightened. She flipped forward. The circles appeared again and again. Each time there were notes in the margins, short, urgent, almost out of character. Water stacking in the bay. Wind shifts stronger than forecast. Unstable pattern. Watch this. Mara swallowed. Her fingers moved faster now, flipping pages until she reached the most recent entries. Years old, but suddenly not distant at all. And there it was, a sequence. Wind direction, pressure drop, tide surge, timing. It matched. Not perfectly, but close enough to make her chest tighten. She pushed back from the desk, heart beginning to pound in a slow, heavy rhythm. No, she whispered, more to steady herself than to deny it. She stood and walked to the window. The bay stretched out in the darkness, black and quiet, like it was holding something beneath the surface. The marina lights flickered faintly along the docks, casting thin reflections that trembled in the water. It looked calm, but it didn't feel right. Mara had grown up reading small things. The way ropes creaked before a gust, the way birds shifted inland before weather turned. And right now, something in the air felt off, too still in the wrong places, too tense in the others. She went back to the desk, grabbed a pencil, and started marking the pages, connecting dates, matching them with what she'd heard on the radio earlier that day. Offshore pressure changes, a weak storm forming farther out in the Pacific. Individually, none of it meant disaster. Together, it told a different story. If the wind shifted the way her mother had documented, if the offshore system strengthened even slightly, if the tide hit at the same time, the water wouldn't just rise, it would push straight into the bay, straight into the marina, straight into the heart of the town, right where the summer festival was being set up. Mara stepped back, her breath shallow now. They're going to be out there, she said under her breath. All of them, families, kids, tourists who didn't know the water, people who trusted the docks, the lights, the music, people who had no idea how fast the ocean could change its mind. For a moment, fear tried to take over. Not loud, not panicked, just heavy. The kind that tells you you're too young, too alone, too uncertain to carry something this big. But then another thought pushed through it, clearer, sharper. If she was wrong, People would laugh. If she was right, people could die. Mara closed her eyes just for a second. Then she grabbed the tied notebooks, stuffed them into her backpack, and pulled on her father's old jacket. The fabric still smelled faintly like salt and engine oil, like steadiness, like someone who would have known what to do. "I'm not waiting," she said quietly. The door creaked as she pushed it open. The wind hit her full in the face now, cooler, stronger than it had been an hour ago. The kind of wind that didn't belong to a calm night. Mara stepped out onto the dock, boots thudding softly against the worn wood. The marina stretched out ahead of her, empty, forgotten. The one place in town nobody was paying attention to anymore. And maybe the one place that still had a chance to save them. She didn't run. She moved with purpose, fast but controlled, heading up toward the road that led back into town, toward the lights, toward the people who wouldn't want to hear a word she had to say, but she was going anyway. Because sometimes being ignored doesn't mean you're wrong. Sometimes it just means you're the first one to see what's coming. The humiliation that hardened her. By noon the next day, the whole town seemed to be pointed toward the water. Colorful banners fluttered over Bay Street. Food trucks lined the curb. Folding tables appeared outside bait shops and souvenir stands. Someone was testing speakers near the festival stage, and the sound of country music drifted across the harbor in bright, cheerful bursts that felt almost offensive to Mara now. Everything looked normal. That was the part that unsettled her most. The sky was still blue over most of the bay, but not the soft, easy blue of a harmless summer day. Farther out, past the headland, a darker band was gathering low over the water. The gulls were louder than usual. The wind came in uneven pulls, then paused, then returned sharper. Mara noticed all of it. Nobody else seemed to. She crossed the street toward the town office with her mother's tied notebooks in her backpack and a knot pulled tight in her stomach. She had barely slept. She had spent the early morning checking the marina, watching the pilings, studying the current around the slips, testing the old backup lights in the storage shed. Every hour had made her more certain. By the time she stepped inside the office, Mayor Leland Price was already moving fast, smiling too much, dressed like a man preparing for a newspaper photo. Two volunteers were carrying festival packets through the hallway. Someone had taped a poster to the wall that read, "Harbor Days, our best summer yet." Mara waited until he looked up. "Mayor Price, I need a minute." He gave her the kind of smile adults give teenagers when they plan to dismiss them politely. "Mara, bit busy this morning. It's about the water." That got his attention for half a second. She pulled out one of the notebooks and opened it across the counter. "The tide's wrong. The wind's already shifting earlier than forecast. If that offshore system turns the way I think it will, the surge is going to push straight into the marina and lower Festival Row." Mayor Price glanced at the pages but didn't really read them. "Where'd you get this?" "My mother kept these records for years. I checked them against this week's marine report." He leaned back, folding his arms. "Mara, I'm sorry for what you've been through. I truly am. But we're not shutting down a town event because of handwritten notes and a bad feeling." "It's not a bad feeling," she said, forcing her voice to stay level. "It's a pattern." Before he could answer, Deputy Eli Grant stepped into the office from the side hallway, hat in hand, radio clipped at his shoulder. He was in his 30s, calm-faced, the kind of man people trusted because he didn't make much noise unless he needed to. "Everything all right?" he asked. Mayor Price gave a small sigh. "Mara thinks the festival needs to be moved." Eli looked at her then, and unlike the mayor, he actually listened. Mara turned the notebook toward him. "The water's stacking in the bay. You can already see it near the slips if you know where to look. If the wind keeps turning, the surge will hit right when the crowds are thickest." Eli studied the page longer than the mayor had. "You bring this to the weather service?" "I don't have time for that." He nodded once, thoughtful but cautious. "I'm not saying you're wrong, but I can't clear out half the waterfront based on private notes and observation alone." There it was again. Not cruelty, not mockery, just the clean, frustrating wall of official doubt. Mara picked up the notebook. "By the time everyone agrees, it'll be too late." Mayor Price's tone hardened. "What'll be too late is salvaging this town's summer if people start spreading panic. We need a good weekend, Mara. Folks around here depend on it." That sentence stayed with her, not because it was evil, because it was ordinary. That was how people made bad decisions in small towns all the time. Not through villainy, through pressure, through pride, through needing one good weekend badly enough to pretend warning signs weren't real. Mara walked back out into the sunlight, with the notebook pressed against her chest and the sting of humiliation burning under her skin. On the sidewalk, she could hear kids laughing near the kettle corn stand. A church group was hanging paper lanterns. Tourists stopped to photograph the water, and then she saw Calvin. He was standing near a seafood booth, talking to two men she recognized from the Marina supply yard. He spotted her immediately. "Well," he said loud enough for all three to hear, "looks like the harbor prophet's back." One of the men chuckled. Mara kept walking. Calvin wasn't done. "You tell the mayor the ocean's coming for all of us?" She stopped. Slowly she turned around. Her face was still, but inside something raw was trembling. "I told him enough to give people a chance." Calvin shoved his hands into his pockets and gave a brittle laugh. "You're sleeping in a dead marina and carrying notebooks around like they're scripture? You need help, Mara, not an audience." A few people nearby glanced over. That was the worst part. Not the words. The witnesses. The quick, uncomfortable silence of strangers hearing your private pain turned into public embarrassment. Mara felt the heat rise in her face. For one weak human second, she wanted to disappear. Then she looked past Calvin, out toward the water. The tide had crept higher against the lower pilings. Not much, but enough. And suddenly something inside her changed. She was done asking to be believed. Done wasting breath trying to win over people who needed disaster to look official before they would call it real. If they wouldn't prepare publicly, she would prepare alone. Or almost alone, because as she turned toward the road leading back to Collins Point Marina, a voice called after her. "Mara." She stopped. It was Tessa Ruiz, wiping grease from her hands with a red shop rag, her dark hair tied up, her work boots dusty from the engine shed. "I heard what you said in there," Tessa said, "and I think you're seeing something the rest of them aren't." Mara stared at her, caught between relief and disbelief. Tessa gave one small nod toward the harbor. "So tell me what needs to be done." And for the first time that day, Mara didn't feel embarrassed. She felt dangerous. Not wild, not reckless, just clear. The kind of clear that comes when a person finally understands that being laughed at hurts less than standing still while people walk into danger. The night the water took the town, the first wave of panic did not begin with screaming. It began with confusion. Just after sundown, Harbor Days was still going. The string lights over Bay Street had come on. Music rolled across the waterfront. People were laughing, eating, drifting from booth to booth with the easy, sun-warmed carelessness of folks who believed the day had ended safely. Then the wind changed. Not gradually, suddenly. It came off the water in one hard, muscular sweep that rattled vendor tents, snapped loose banners sideways, and sent paper cups skittering across the pavement. A few people looked up. A few laughed. Someone near the stage made a joke about coastal weather. But Mara, standing at the end of the old marina dock, did not laugh. She felt it in her bones before she saw it. The air had turned colder, sharper, the kind of cold that didn't belong to a summer evening. Out beyond the harbor mouth, the water had gone dark and strangely heaped, as if the bay itself were being pushed from behind by something large and impatient. "Tessa!" Mara shouted. Tessa looked up from the office door. Mara pointed toward the outer channel. "It's here!" The next few minutes moved with brutal speed. A blast of wind hit the harbor lot so hard that one of the festival tents tore loose and cartwheeled into a seafood stand. People yelled. The music cut out in a burst of static. Then the lights near the stage flickered once, twice, and went dead. The waterfront dropped into a strange, broken darkness. Only the emergency glow from food trucks and a few battery lanterns remained, swinging wildly in the wind. Across the bay came a sound Mara would remember for the rest of her life. Not thunder. Not exactly. A deep, rolling crash of water slamming into pilings, docks, and rock with more force than the town had prepared for. Then the surge hit. Water rushed over the lower boardwalk in a fast, ugly sheet, swallowing trash cans, folding chairs, coolers, and people's shoes before they understood what was happening. Children cried out. Adults grabbed for one another. Somebody fell. A vendor trailer jerked sideways with a metallic groan. Mara was already running. She sprinted up the dock, boots pounding wet boards, and hit the gravel drive at full speed. "Get off the lower street," she yelled. "Move uphill! Leave the cars!" Her voice cut through the confusion with an authority that surprised even the people who had dismissed her hours earlier. Some listened immediately because terror had stripped away their pride. Others froze. That was when Deputy Eli Grant appeared out of the dark, soaked to the shoulders, radio in hand. "The South Road is flooding," he shouted over the wind. We've got people trapped by the vendor row. Mara didn't hesitate. Bring them to Collins Point, she yelled back. Use the back service lane behind the bait warehouse. Not Bay Street. Bay Street's going under first. Eli stared at her for one sharp second. Then he nodded. And that was it. That was the moment he chose to trust her. From there, the whole night became movement. Urgent, relentless, half seen in rain and flying spray. Tessa kept the old generator running, flooding the Marina office and storage shed with weak but steady light. Owen took the skiff into water no sane man would have touched in the dark, hauling two older tourists and a terrified little boy from a half-submerged parking area near the harbor gift shop. Mara moved between them all like someone who had been carrying this night inside her for hours. She knew where the ground rose quickest, knew which dock ramps would hold and which would roll under the force of the water, knew which side path behind the ice shed stayed clear even when the main road flooded. She shouted directions, hauled blankets, pulled sobbing children by the hand, and kept repeating the same words over and over. This way, keep moving, stay together, don't stop at the cars. Then she saw Calvin. He was trapped inside the old ticket booth near the festival lot, one side of it already shoved crooked by the surge. Water slammed around the base while he pounded on the jammed door with both hands. For one flashing human instant, Mara stopped. This was the man who had thrown her out, the man who had laughed, the man who had made her grief feel like weakness. Tessa saw him too. Mara! There was no time to think. Mara lunged through knee-deep water, then waist-deep, the cold hitting like a blow. She reached the booth, braced her boots against the side frame, and shouted, "Move back!" Calvin did. She jammed a broken dock hook into the warped edge of the door and pulled with everything she had. Once, twice. The frame gave. The door burst open. Calvin stumbled out, gasping, and nearly lost his footing in the current. Mara caught his arm before the water could spin him sideways. "Come on," she shouted. He looked at her with a stunned, hollow expression, but she did not stop to read it. She dragged him toward higher ground, step by freezing step, until Eli reached them and took Calvin's other side. By midnight, Collins Point Marina was no longer a dead place at the edge of town. It had become the heart of what was left standing. Families huddled inside the office and supply shed, wrapped in old blankets. Lantern lights shook across frightened faces. Wet children slept against their mothers. Owen tied off the skiff with shaking hands. Tessa checked fuel levels at the generator, like a woman keeping a pulse alive. And Mara stood just outside the office, drenched and breathless, staring at the black water still moving through the lower streets. The town had not listened to her voice when it came as a warning. It had listened when that same voice became a way out. And in the long, cold dark of that storm-torn night, the abandoned marina they had all written off became the one place everybody needed. The place they almost threw away. By morning, the storm had moved inland. What it left behind was silence. Not true silence, of course. There were still generators humming in the distance, sirens farther up the road, the slap of loose rope against wet pilings, the soft murmur of exhausted people speaking in low voices because nobody had the strength left for anything louder. But it was a different kind of town now. The bright festival banners were gone. The lower harbor street was buried in debris. Mud, broken wood, soaked cardboard, and overturned tables lay scattered like the remains of a celebration that had never belonged to real life in the first place. Mara stood outside the Marina office wrapped in an old wool blanket, her father's jacket still wet at the cuffs. She looked tired enough to disappear where she stood. Her hair was tangled from rain and salt. Her hands were scraped raw. Her legs ached from hours of bracing against cold water and moving people uphill through the dark. And yet, for the first time in a long while, she did not feel cast out. She felt claimed, not by the storm, by the work. Inside the office, families were waking slowly on cots, benches, and folded tarps. A little boy Mara had helped carry in during the worst of the surge sat at the window eating crackers, still wrapped in a silver emergency blanket. An older couple Owen had pulled from the flooded lot were sharing coffee from a paper cup. Tessa was already checking fuel and making a list of what they had left. Collins Point Marina, the place people had called dead, useless, finished, had become the one place that held. Deputy Eli Grant came down the dock just after sunrise, boots wet, face drawn with fatigue. He stopped in front of Mara and took off his hat. In a small town, that kind of gesture meant something. "We counted again," he said. "No fatalities." Mara closed her eyes for one brief second, not because she wanted praise, Because her body finally had a place to put the fear. Eli looked back toward the road, where volunteers had begun sorting supplies beside the Marina shed. "You saved people last night," he said. "A lot of them." Mara let out a tired breath. "A lot of us saved people." He gave a quiet nod, but his expression didn't change. Maybe because he knew what she meant. Maybe because he also knew it had started with one voice nobody wanted to hear. A little later, Mayor Leland Price came by too. He did not arrive with speeches or cameras or polished words. The storm had stripped all that away. His jacket was muddy, his face looked older. He stood awkwardly in front of the office, glanced at the waterline, still staining the lower posts, and said the one thing men like him rarely say easily. "I should have listened." Mara looked at him for a long moment. Then she answered the only honest way she could. "Yes, you should have." There was no cruelty in it, just truth. And sometimes truth, spoken plainly, is the cleanest mercy a person can offer. By mid-morning, Calvin came down the gravel drive. He walked slower than usual, like a man carrying more than he could explain. He stopped near the bent Marina sign, set both hands on it, and straightened it until the old board stood upright again. He didn't apologize right away. Maybe he couldn't. Maybe some men find regret easier to carry than confession. When he finally turned to Mara, his eyes were tired and unsteady. "You came back for me," he said. Mara held his gaze. "Yeah," she said. He swallowed hard, as if those two simple words hurt more than anger would have. Then he looked around at the people resting inside the marina, at the volunteers hauling bottled water, at the old office lit by daylight and purpose. And something in him seemed to give way. "I was wrong, Medic," he said quietly. Mara didn't rush to comfort him. She didn't need to. Some wounds heal through apology. Others heal when the truth is finally spoken out loud. Over the next few days, Collins Point Marina became more than a shelter. It became a center. Boats brought in supplies. Church groups cooked meals on folding tables. Teenagers helped clear debris. Owen stayed sober and worked without being asked. Tessa organized tools, blankets, batteries, and first aid kits with the crisp authority of someone who had long ago learned that panic is best answered with useful hands. And Mara found herself stepping into a place she had never been invited into before. Not the place of a child, not the place of a burden, a place of trust. A week later, when the roads reopened and the first official town meeting was held, people gathered in the high school gym because the waterfront building was still too damaged. Mayor Price stood at the microphone and announced that Collins Point Marina would not be sold. The town voted to preserve it, not as a relic, as a coastal emergency hub and training center, a place where young people could learn tide safety, storm prep, first aid, radio basics, and how to read the water before the water turned dangerous. Then he asked Mara in front of everyone if she would help lead it. The room fell quiet. Mara thought of her father, of her mother's notebooks, of the night she walked down that gravel road with nowhere to go, and of the strange, humbling truth that sometimes the place people try to throw away becomes the very place that saves them. She said yes, not because everything was fixed, not because the hurt was gone, but because staying bitter would have been smaller than the future now standing in front of her. That evening after the meeting, Mara returned to the office alone. The marina was quiet again. Wind moved gently across the bay. The water, for once, looked honest. She sat at the old desk and untied the faded blue string around her mother's tied notebooks. Then she opened to a blank page. For a moment, she just stared at it. Then in her own handwriting, she wrote the date. Below it, she added a single line, "Watch carefully. What people ignore may one day save them." She set the pencil down and looked out at the dock, at the repaired sign, at the place that had carried her grief and given her back a life. And maybe that is the part worth remembering. Not that Mara was doubted, not even that she was right, but that she chose in her deepest hurt to become useful instead of cruel. So let me ask you something. Have you ever been the one person who saw the danger or the value before anyone else did? And if you were, would you still have the courage to stand your ground when nobody believed you? If this story moved you, stay with us. Subscribe to the channel, share this video with someone who needs a little hope, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Because sometimes a story isn't just a story. Sometimes it's a reminder not to give up on the part of you that still knows how to see clearly.